Hi, my name is Heidi Hasbrook. I am an associate director and the visual methods lead at Kantar Public in the UK. And I thought today it would be a useful thing to talk about a specific project that we worked on and how we used visual methods and creative methods considering the ethical implications of the research. So we worked with, for Shelter. For those not in the UK, Shelter is a very large housing charity within the UK that focuses on poverty and homelessness. And what they realized, Shelter had the issue, they realized that they work with people that have experienced homelessness, but had never really tested the language and terminologies that they use to communicate about, for, and to people that were experiencing housing and homelessness issues. So they commissioned us to conduct some qualitative research with people that are or have experienced homelessness or housing issues in the UK. And I say homelessness and housing issues because it's quite a broad spectrum of people. So this included people that were at risk of becoming homeless, people that were sofa surfing, people that were sleeping rough, people that were sleeping in temporary or long-term temporary accommodation. So it was quite a broad spectrum. And in order to do this, it caused a nice, healthy, ethical conversation within our team, and to produce the right methodology that spoke to the issues, responded to the issues, and didn't add to some of the issues that Shelter was trying to address. So we wanted to be able to let the participants represent themselves, but without exploiting their image. And because this is ultimately about how people want to be spoken about, we thought we want to make sure their voices are in the outputs and in the process of the research. So we conducted face-to-face interviews, both paired and individual. We chose to let the participants choose themselves for comfort reasons. And this was 46 people across England and Scotland. And these were conducted in shelters or in social spaces such as church basements and things like this, or shelter spaces, community spaces. We audio recorded the interviews, and we also asked the participants to conduct a pre-task, which was take 3 photos. And these photos were something that made you smile today, something that frustrated you today, and the space you slept in last night. And we often use pre-tasks anyway within qualitative research, but this was really to break the ice and allow us to get into a conversation and give a talking point. Also allowed, and then we also utilized this pre-task for our output. And so both those images and the audio recordings became part of the final presentation. So what were these kind of ethical considerations, and how did it affect the outputs? Well, we considered the ethics of representation within that data collection and then our output. So my background is documentary filmmaking, and so I'm used to representing images of people, and that kind of straight answer whenever I hear any brief is, how can I make a film out of this? But actually I had to think, how do I represent these people without reproducing the images and stereotypes that are often were kind of oversaturated with the image of a homeless person or a person with housing issues, and wanting to avoid that and actually hear them instead of just see them, and also allow them to determine how they are seen. So we avoided any images of people unless if they included them and wanted to include them. So if they, for example, took a selfie or wanted to, or other images of themselves and their families, and they wanted to include that, we included that. But otherwise, it was images of spaces and objects. We focused on the words. So the output, the audio recordings weren't amazing, partly because of the spaces we were doing them in, and also because the various audio recorders we were using across the country. And also because of accents. So there was a lot of different regional accents that were happening from Glasgow to inner London to migrants and various things. So we made sure that the words were being heard by animating the words as they were saying them in the output. And then it was really important that we were both testing shelter's language. So they did have some comms language testing that we included as activities, but also grounding that discussion in those varying experiences people had. So I mentioned at the beginning, there was the variation in what is homelessness, and then also the reasons people might have led to these housing issues. And we wanted to make sure that that discussion was the center point. And so there was a lot about people's overall experiences and living situations. And then this was put through a thematic analysis that we commonly do, but we added the extra layer of how does this become a further output besides a report. And what came out was something between a podcast, a presentation, and a film. We wanted it to be a standalone output that Shelter could use and disseminate without us present. So while a lot of presentations often need the presenter, this was something that stood on its own. Our internal team's obsession with podcasts, and also the point about representation of images, and this was really about words, it was a little bit more podcasty, but it was still in the form of a film output. There were still some visuals, there was still the animation of words. So something in between there. We haven't come up with a word for it yet, but we found it quite interesting. So with that said, I thought I would show everybody, since this is about visual methods, show everybody a clip from the podcasty, presentation-y, filmy. And one of the things that we found in that thematic analysis was the variations and the unique experiences of people meant that actually there were some themes that came out that differentiated the reasons and the motivations and the feeling about their experience of homelessness. And so one of those, which I found quite interesting, was the gender differences. So we had heard a few experiences of women speaking about their housing situation, and their experience of homelessness was actually not a step down, but actually a step towards a more positive opportunity or experience, and it was a brave step, often leaving a worse situation. And this was a really important consideration when you're thinking about the language of speaking about people that are homeless or experiencing housing issues. Are we degrading their bravery in the situation that they're in? And so it really made us think about what that language was, and created a really healthy conversation for Shelter. So here's a clip from that.
One foot in front of the other for me at the moment. So one day at a time, one good day, one crushingly bad day. A lot of that is dependent on how my kids are and how they're dealing with things.
Probably when I was forced to kind of move with my mum. You know, when I split up with the father of the children, and with his behaviour, I was forced for my own safety to move out to my mother's. So yeah, I suppose I was homeless, yeah.
Okay, so what are some of the implications of using an output like this? And I think that's a big consideration. A lot of the times we use visual methods within research, mainly for an output. And I felt like this project specifically was about the process. It was as much about the methodology as it was about the outputs. But for Shelter, what we found was this created a really good opportunity to disseminate internally to inform future communication strategies. So by having this, what turned out to be about an 8-minute video, they could pass that around shelter and nobody had to read the 35-page report that goes along with it if they didn't want to. And they could get the main points out with what are some of the best communications, what are the considerations while they're developing those communications. And they were hearing from the voices of the people, and it was reminding them, and those words were becoming central. It was also presented at a consortium of housing and poverty charities to support informing communications more broadly across the sector. So as I said at the beginning, Shelter is one of the larger housing charities within the UK, and there's a lot of grassroots and smaller charities that don't necessarily have the money to conduct this research. So Shelter wanted to share it more widely to make sure that that people knew the outputs of it and could consider it for their own communications, and that maybe there was a linking between these charities, which leads to a larger aim for Shelter, which was Shelter was trying to position itself as a leading voice and an ethically sound one within their sector. And this was really important with everything that's happened in the UK with Grenfell, and there's a lot of housing issues currently in the UK, and there's a large grassroots movement. Shelter wanted to ensure that it was not being written off as that kind of large money charity, but also ethically sound and listening to grassroots and listening to the people that they serve. And this was a part of that agenda to ensure that they fit within this grassroots movement and didn't sit separate from it. And so that was in short, the main outputs. And it was a bit different than some of the other more kind of traditional 5-minute short ethnographic films that we do, but we also do those and many other things. So if you are interested in understanding a bit more about what Kantar Public does, you can check out our showreel on Vimeo, and there's the password there. It's password protected. So please do check out more, and I'd love to hear a bit about what other people are doing and how this might relate to their work. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. So Heidi, on that show reel, is there more information from this project?
Not this project specifically. Actually, it's not on, oddly enough, it's not on that show reel. The project, I believe some of the work is published on Shelter's site. If I can find the links, I can always forward them on to you. So when you send it around.
Great.
But yeah.
Okay, so if you are looking to ask a question, now is when you need to do it. We've got some time for that. I'm going to start off with a really straightforward question and not addressing the meat of what you were doing at all, really.
Yeah.
Great job title, Visual Methods Lead. So what does that entail?
It's a growing situation, but basically my background is, as I mentioned, in documentary filmmaking and using visual methods and just generally creative methods for research purposes. So both in academia and social research, and then working with children and everything. So I came into Kantar Public, and it really means that I do a lot of the training up of people that might not have this similar backgrounds, and leading on developing that methodology when we're putting in proposals and everything, and consistently being the earworm in every brief that comes in saying, how can we include the visual element? How can we include the creative element? And so it's really that kind of facilitating role. And I've been doing it for about 2 years at Kantar at Public. And in those 2 years, I think we've made between 8 and I think we're on our 10th or 12th visual output project, which is pretty exciting. So it's growing. And it means that our team is also growing in their skill set, which is great.
We've got another practical question come in, so I'll go to that question shortly. But a couple about the project and the ethics. So when you use subtitles, sometimes there's an issue that people have complained about in that somebody with a Glaswegian accent has a subtitle put under what they're saying. And I noticed it wasn't under, it was separate here. And then somebody speaks from Hampshire, and there is no subtitle.
Ours was not, I mean, this wasn't, so as you saw, not all of it was, we decided, we didn't do subtitles per se. What we decided was to animate keywords within what they were saying. So it was, the idea was as if this was a presentation and their voices weren't there, we would have maybe had the bullet points and it was allowing those bullet points to be underlaid by the actual audio, the original audio.
Yeah.
So we didn't differentiate. I completely agree. It drives me up the wall when certain people get subtitled and certain people don't. And interestingly, you can hear my American accent. I get the privilege of consistently asking people to clarify because they're not as offended when an American asks, "What did you say?" as when another English person asks, "What did you say?" But yeah, it was actually more around, a bit about regional accents, but it was more around the quality of the audio and making sure that it was just clear and that we were getting those main points out and bringing them to life.
And in terms of the role of this podcast come film come presentation, was it replace a report, or was it to create something that would have a more general consumption that a report never would have gone to? Because Shelter will make commercials, they will make documentaries, they will make things that try to get people to take action, or to give money, or to do things like this, or to tell MPs that they need to do something different. But I think what I'm hearing is that this was a method of imparting information and data to people in a different format. Is that right?
Yeah, this was definitely, I mean, this is not for their normal media campaigns. They're very strong. They have a very high quality commercial media campaigns. This was actually more about disseminating to other housing charities and internally for their comms development. So this was more research for their own development and other charities' development versus, so it wasn't going to go on their social media or anything like that. This was an internal facing, I guess you could say internal with their external stakeholders basic project. We did write a report as well, and that's partly because they do like robust reports. And I actually really enjoyed the report. The report was quite interesting as well, but we did try to make sure that the presentation, that's why it was a bit longer. Normally when we make visual methods, we try to keep it kind of under 5 minutes. And this was much more, there was some, that's why I said it was almost presentation-y-ish, because there was some kind of slides within it, and kind of information and paragraphs within it so that it could stand alone and not just be spoken over.
Super. Now, here's the sort of the very practical question I mentioned that's come in. We're quite restricted in terms of the budgets that we have available for research. How do you recommend we use visual methods with a limited budget?
Yeah, this is always the big issue. I think, I mean, Shelter has a very limited budget, and we tend to be charitable with our offering to Shelter because it's something that, you know, as an organization, we see as part of our responsibility, and also because it keeps our researchers quite impassioned because we like working with them. But generally speaking, what we found is, and what I've been working on is figuring out how it is something that a client can see as not an expensive add-on, but integral to the research. And that's why I think it's important for it to not be just seen as an output, but also as a research method. And particularly when you're working with hard to reach or vulnerable communities. So in my previous role, I worked for a research company that specifically worked with children and young people. And so visual methods were a very obvious choice, because when you're doing an interview with a 4-year-old, they don't actually articulate words. It's very hard to put a quote down, but their body language is so important, and the way their eyes pop open, or, you know, the way that they snarl at something, or, you know, just their boredom or anything along those lines becomes so important, or the space that they live in and their worldview becomes really important. So visual methods became very easy to sell within that space. And who doesn't like watching videos of children? And then I think particularly when we've done research projects, for example, with people with visual and hearing impairments, ranging from impairments to complete blind and deafness. And again, this was a methodology that was taking into consideration the ethics and the needs of the people that we were interviewing. So by using, and also the outputs were a consideration of how they would be able to utilize them. So by having a film that had large subtitles, but also the sound allowed more access than a report might allow to the very people we're doing the research about. So sometimes it becomes that ethical consideration. It can get written in. With that said, I don't think it's actually, I always say it's like for like. The cost of writing a report or the cost of making a film can often be similar. And this is obviously, you can get very high polished and very expensive films. It's how long's a piece of string. But for the needs of a lot of our clients, they don't need something that's going to be put on television. They need something that's going to give that information and bring something to life. So I think it is still feasible within it, particularly if you're training up your team to be able to produce those images.
Thank you, Heidi.